This tape is designed to help make your encounters with members of the media at DECWORLD as successful as possible. While it does not replace media training, it will help you to understand media relations and show you some techniques used in interviews. Before you deal with the media, you need to understand the underpinnings of media relations. For instance, what is an interview? An interview is an opportunity to deliver specific messages to specific audiences. It is not an intellectual discussion between you and the journalist. As seductive as it is to have someone hang on your every word, you need to discipline yourself to deliver only the messages that you want to see or hear in the finished article or broadcast. The more information you give a journalist, the more he or she has to choose from in writing the final piece. A reporter's job is to write a story that is newsworthy. You can help by having that story well packaged and ready for him or her. By carefully choosing your messages, you can take control of the interview. Prepare and know your key messages ahead of time. Communications research suggests that 3 key messages are the optimum number. Not only can your audience absorb that number of concepts well, but you will be able to keep them firmly in your mind during the interview. They'll provide a safe harbor should the interview begin to move away from its original intent. You will need to anticipate any tough questions that you might be asked and prepare answers that diffuse these types of questions. Never lie, mislead, or exaggerate, but close off the questioning and lead the reporter back to your messages. This technique is known as closing a door and opening a window, and you'll see examples of it further on in this tape. Reporters are always looking for quotable language. Colorful, interesting, or unusual quotes can help them sum up an issue or explain a difficult subject through analogy or metaphor. The converse is also true. If you don't want to be quoted, keep your language as bland as possible. Always turn negatives to positives, and remember to use language that you're certain both the reporter and his or her audience, the reader, will understand. Avoid jargon. When you're dealing with the media, there is a great temptation to be an expert in everything. Understand that it's perfectly acceptable to say, "I don't know" to a question, or to acknowledge that you're not the expert in the area, but that you'll find someone to answer the question. Don't extend your answers beyond your area of expertise. Find the public relations person in your area, or refer the journalist back to the press analyst consultant suite to find an expert to answer his or her question. And finally, contrary to popular myth, there is nothing off the record. If you don't want to see it in print or hear it on the radio or television, don't say it. In an uncontrolled atmosphere such as DECWORLD, this is even more important to remember. In the time before, during, or after an actual interview, always be aware of the fact that you're speaking to a journalist and that you can be quoted. And be careful about sharing internal company information with other digital employees in public places. More internal business information has become external on airplanes, in restaurants, in restrooms, or on elevators. Just because you're with digital people, you are not in digital. Dealing with the media can be summed up in 2 basic tenets: be prepared, and there is nothing off the record. Recognize your competence, but also recognize that the journalist brings skills and preparation to the interview. Think out the implications of what you say and prepare carefully. When you deal with the media, it is as much your job as your regular responsibilities, and it requires work in preparation. To not prepare is to underestimate the reporter and the skills he or she will bring to the interview. Now, let's talk a bit about reporters' skills. None of them will seem particularly earth-shaking taken alone, but their combination comprises a formidable package. All journalists are trained in the skill of interviewing. Whether they're trained in journalism school or on the job, they know how to keep an interview going and how to elicit answers to their questions. This may not seem like much of an observation that requires rocket science, but it needs to be made if we're looking to level the playing field. Reporters are gregarious by nature. If they were not, they wouldn't be reporters. If you are shy by nature, you may feel at a disadvantage with a gregarious reporter. Take refuge in your messages and remember that you have a newsworthy story to tell. Almost every reporter works a beat, be it business, healthcare, or technology. They understand the issues that are important to their readers. You must understand those issues too and guide the reporter to your story. Journalists prefer negative language, inflammatory examples, and contrasts. They like to pit one side against the other. It makes good copy. Think about the kinds of stories you like to read. You like something with a little tension in it and some good quotes. If we didn't like this kind of reading, there wouldn't be publications like the National Enquirer or the Star. They're the polar examples of this technique. I always like to tell people that I'm training that journalists will use all of the manners your mother taught you against you. Your mother taught you not to be tedious in conversation. For instance, if you're in a social situation and you're trying to make a complex point, if someone paraphrases it not quite correctly by saying what you're really saying is, you'll nod your head, even if it's close. Don't ever do that with a journalist. It gives him or her license to put quotation marks around the paraphrase and attribute it to you. Go back and restate your message more clearly. Journalists also know how to apply pressure to force you to respond. Once again, your mother's lessons in good manners are abused. She taught you to keep up your side of the conversation and not to be tedious. There are two common ways that a reporter will try to force you to respond. The first is to continually ask you the same rephrased question, hoping that you'll respond differently. Simply rephrase your messages and stick to your guns. He or she will finally give up. And second, they'll use silence. You reply to a question with your message and then there's silence. Your first instinct is to fill it, sometimes with babble. Don't do it. If you've delivered all of your message, simply wait out the silence. Remember, it's the reporter's job to keep the interview going, and he or she will resume questions when it's clear that you don't intend to babble. Journalists will try to create a sense of obligation in you to respond to them. This is particularly common with broadcast journalists who say, we want to get it for the noon broadcast and the van is on the way. The days are gone when publicists would say, I don't care what you say about me as long as you spell my name right. There's no obligation to do any story without preparation that includes a risk-benefit analysis. Your public relations counsel will help you to qualify any potential story. People who have done interviews often wonder how it is that they've been quoted out of context. And it often happens when a reporter has the bias of the story already in mind. You must know the reporter's agenda and be precise with your language so that it cannot be taken out of context. And finally, try to be natural and conversational when speaking with a reporter. He or she can recognize company speak a mile away. So I'm asking you to be precise and cautious with your words and deliver them as though you've just thought of them. Dealing with the media is as much work as your regular work, but there's no magic to it. It's just a combination of technique and content, and the more you do it, the better at it you'll become. Now we can look at some examples of people who have dealt with the media well or poorly. All of these examples are taken from news broadcasts, with the exception of an excerpt from the Bob Newhart Show that I like to call Your Interview from Hell. The first example shows how important it is to concentrate and pay attention.
Dr. Leonard Riggs is vice president of the American College of Emergency Physicians. 78 Americans were treated in emergency rooms last year. That accounts for millions of dollars in services. In terms of talking about emergency room care, should the public sit down and choose, over here, should the public sit down and choose an emergency room, or should they just go to any hospital?
Well, Roz, I think it's up to the public to determine what sort of hospitals are available in their area. If they have a physician, a family physician.
His message was great, but the minute she had to say over here, it was all over. The next cut is an object lesson in nothing being off the record. Watch this man's body language.
Public relations spokesman for the RTA, had this to say about the hikes.
You've told me that a fare increase is a fait accompli.
Can we stop a minute? Wait a minute.
Well, you just told me that a fare increase is a fait accompli.
You got me a little confused before.
Are you denying that?
you stop for 1 second? I'm not sure I know what you meant before.
You're not,
No.
you're not sure you knew what I meant?
Well, Mr. K later told me that he had been confused by when he earlier said that the hikes were a fait accompli. He said the RTA board had not yet made a decision and that public opinion would be taken.
This is a good example of how journalists' goals and ours may not always coincide. Leon K. was fired, and she was bumped up to the network. The next two examples illustrate the technique closing a door and opening a window. Carl Gerstacker was the chairman of Dow Chemical. As much as the company wanted to concentrate on their life science strategy, napalm would always come back to haunt them. Gerstacker anticipated his tough question and guided Hugh Downs back to his message, closing the door on the tough one and opening the window to his message.
Now it's 13:30 after the hour. We have with us this morning the head of one of the nation's major corporations who believes that protecting the environment is good business as well as good citizenship. He's Mr. Carl A. Gerstacker, who's the chairman of the Dow Chemical Company and also chairman of the Committee for Environmental Quality and Control of the entire chemical industry. Welcome to today, Mr. Gerstacker.
Thank you.
On that subject of corporate conscience and so forth, where it's bolstered by expediency, of course it's all going in the same direction, and that's fine, but you at Dow Chemical quit manufacturing napalm in 1969, I believe. Was that a result of the public pressures and the fact that television had shown what napalm does?
No, Hugh. We haven't been making it since May of '69 simply because we did lose the contract on a bid. We would be willing to make it again if the government asked us to make it, because simply as long as our country is drafting young men and sending them out, while we don't like war, we don't like any wars, we think our young men should be supported, so we would make it again. But Hugh...
So that wasn't the reason for not making it?
We don't make napalm. I'd rather talk about products we do make.
Yeah.
Dow's in the life science business. For example, we have a measles vaccine that's been out since 1965. About 50 million.
If Gerstacker closes the door, Bush slams it in this one.
Governor Reagan recently expressed doubts about the theory of evolution. Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in leaving it out of this campaign, and I'm not going to answer any questions on it because I just don't want to get diverted. You know, we've been sitting here for 22 minutes. You know what the #1 issue in this campaign is? It isn't evolution, it's the economy. And I'm not here to dictate what questions.
Some issues never change. Avoiding jargon in speaking to the press is sometimes difficult, but it's very important, as you'll see in the next two examples. The first is a medical example, so you'll see how it feels not to understand the jargon. The second pokes fun at the jargon of the computer industry. Either way, the jargon just gets in the way of the message.
We still have Dr. Utijian standing by, and since some questions have been raised about the long-term studies, perhaps you'd like to respond.
Yes, I would. I'd like to take issue with Dr. Efron over this question of bacterial mutation tests. My information is that all the bacterial type of in vitro mutagenesis testing has been negative. The two questionable tests, one of them that jumps to mind is the cystochromatid exchange test and human fibroblasts grown in tissue culture. And this is a single, rather outlying result that is not supported by the bacterial assays, which are the more conventional ones to use.
All right, gentlemen, forgive me for interrupting, but in a sense you're talking way over my head, and I'm sure over the heads of a lot of others. Well, if we can...
Well, it looks like Leroy Powell this time happened to walk through the wrong door.
There's two shows going on at the World Congress Center this week. One of them is the boat show. The other one isn't. This is the other one, the Office Automation Conference. Now look at all of this technology. Look at all these bright, intelligent, well-dressed people. Look at me. There are times in this life when you figure out that there's more than one world in this world. Well, we've been looking around this world, and I'd like to tell you about it. I would like to, but I don't speak the language.
The application builder starts off with this screen, and this is one of the defaults.
Documents that are generated outside the system through a digitizing camera.
And you can create a spreadsheet or be able to crunch numbers, so to speak.
You can put text around it, you can shrink it, you can expand on it.
We can send mail from one BS to another.
You see what I mean? Here we are, hurtling into the future, and there's a whole bunch of us who wouldn't know an interface from a database. As a matter of fact, I think there's a bunch of us at this conference. You can tell which ones we are because we look very agreeable. We stand there and smile and nod a lot. Be saying to yourself, well, fool, if you don't know what's going on there, what are you doing there in the first place? I have a good reason. Now, some of us may be out of place here as a pig at the opera, but I think I've got this figured out. Because if we can ever learn how to use this stuff, then it can do the work. And we can do important things, like lounging around, going fishing.
Leroy Paul, T3.